Topos Institute Colloquium. Today, we're very happy to have Terry Winograd telling us what's up with AI. So please, Terry, whenever you're ready.
Okay, you hear me okay? Um, First of all, I just want to give thanks to B and to David for provoking me to pull together some of the thoughts that I've been having on artificial intelligence. Um, I've learned a tremendous amount from B in our years of working together, and you'll see here how it's influenced the way I think. I also want to thank Fernando Flores, who has been my colleague and teacher and friend for many decades, working with me and others to understand the nature and context of artificial intelligence and much more. And that you'll see again really plays a big part in my thinking here. So let's start off. What's up? Where do things stand? And um, the first thing is everything is new, right? The whole new kind of AI, the LLMs and everything that's followed from them, is totally different from what AI was before. And I don't understand how it works. I have to admit, I'm not an expert on uh, anything having to do with machine learning. Um, and at the same time, I understand how it fits into the world because that hasn't changed in the same way that technology has. The meaning of AI and what it does for people is very much the same as it's been from long ago. History doesn't repeat itself, but as I say, it rhymes. There's a lot going on, which I can say that's like what people were thinking and what we still need to think about. And I'm old enough to remember that last time around, and I'm going to draw on insights from a number of people, you'll see the slides, who were thinking about these issues long before ChatGPT came along and startled all of us. So, what are my concerns? And I want to set the stage here with what I do and don't want to talk a lot about. As I say, it's easy to get lost in talking about is it going to solve all our problems or is it going to be a huge disaster? And those are both very speculative, right? Those are not something we have good information on. It's not something we can really easily predict. We'll talk about prediction later. And talking about those diverts our attention away from the things that really are happening, things that are happening today and in the near future. So my focus is going to be on a variety of problems that are not everything bad or everything good, but what are the changes that are happening because of AI? The other thing I'm going to talk a little about, but not focus on, is the question about the difference between humans and computers. This is a topic which is a fascinating topic and fill whole volumes of philosophy, um, picking out the meaning of all these terms and trying to think about how they apply. It's also very speculative and doesn't tell us what to do or where to go. It is in the negative sense of philosophy, just philosophical. And what I'm going to talk about later on is how care is something which is the difference between humans and computers and how that plays into our choices about what we want computers to do, what we want AI to do. Now, let me just start by giving a little of my own background to how I got into this. I was a graduate student in the MIT AI lab back in the 60s, so we're more than a half a century ago, working on a very early version of natural language processing, very different from current language stuff. Um, and I was part of what later got called GOFAI, Good Old Fashioned AI, GOFAI, which was AI based on a very explicit notion of representation and reasoning. It was like if you thought through problems, how could you take how you thought them through and put that into the computer? As you know, if you're following AI, that's not how current systems work at all. But they did some work in language, which people paid attention to. And then in the mid 70s, I moved to California, to Stanford, and also consulting at the Xerox PARC laboratory, which was doing, you probably know Xerox PARC because of what it did on the personal computer and screens and a whole bunch of technologies that really laid the groundwork for today's computer world. They also, separate from that, had an AI program, and I was part of that AI program. And along with that, there were students from Stanford, graduate students who were both doing work at Xerox and doing their work at Stanford. And they got into conversations, as students tend to do, with people from other places like Berkeley. So they started a discussion group of Stanford and Berkeley AI students. And through that, I got to know more about what was going on there in Berkeley, here, if you, that's where the Zoom is, um, and in particular connected with Hubert Dreyfus, who many of you have heard or have certainly heard of, who was really the first philosopher to take seriously, we need to think about what AI is going to do. And his book, What Computers Can't Do, the title tells it, um, there are many things you can quibble about, but it was really a pioneering effort in trying to look at these questions about what computers can do and what AI means. And as you may know, those of you who know B. Rose, that he was a student of Huber's. Um, in the process of that, I got to meet Fernando Flores, who um, has a very different background. I could spend the whole hour just talking about his background and work. He's fascinating. But we worked together and wrote a book called Understanding Computers and Cognition, which followed in the footsteps of saying, let's think about what AI really is and really can do, not the details of how it's running and what it's doing. So um, that was really a shift in my career and my thinking. I moved away from artificial intelligence and have not done research in that area specifically since. But I'm now, as I'm retired, I'm thinking about research, um, thinking about keeping track, following on with what goes on in AI, and as a bystander in some sense, rather than as a proponent or opponent. Now, what do you think? I'm going to go back to that question I raised at the beginning of, is it going to solve our problems or kill us all? So I have to realize after I'd done my slides, I'd lost track of where I got this list from. But in one of the articles, it was a serious article about what AI is going to do for us. And here's the problems that AI is going to solve: poverty, healthcare, climate, education, global society of harmony and equality. If only. That would be great if anything could do that. Now, your first reaction, as I suspect, is the same as mine, is nothing is going to do all that, AI or anything else. It's just picking a set of things which are aspirations for human life, but an aspiration isn't the same as something for which there's a problem to be solved. It's not problem solving in the sense that we think of that, which is you have a set of boundaries, you know what the possibilities are for action, you figure out which actions are going to do the best, you create. I mean, that's a notion of problem solving which works great for developing technology per se, but not for creating harmony and equality. Right? So this picture, this, by the way, I think is the only AI generated picture that I have in my slides. Um, People are at leisure, having a good time. The robots are doing all the work. Everything is green. Everything is, we got windmills. I mean, everything is wonderful, right? This is not a feasible future. AI can do many positive things, and I'm not going to talk about them today, but of course, if you in medicine, in science, and there are many different areas where AI can be applied for great results. That's not creating harmony in the world. So what's the other side? Apocalypse, right? The AI is going to end up taking over, killing us all, dominating. And there was recently a statement put out by the Future of Life Institute. Max Tegmark is the director at MIT. And he said, well, this is really too dangerous. We got to stop. And there have been people who say for a while, we've got to stop. We call for a prohibition on doing research, on doing development, right? And I will come back later to this slide because I think there's a number of what I would call category errors, probably not the same meaning of category you have, but in talking about what really can be done. But they put out a sort of manifesto saying, this has got to be done now. We have to stop now and then not start again until we've got all the issues resolved. Now, what's interesting about this is it's not new. All right, so this is my advisor at the MIT AI lab, Marvin Minsky, and I'm quoting him from a Life magazine article in 1970. He was interviewed, and I'll let you read the whole thing, but the key parts, which I've put in red, are in a few months it will be at, just by the way, it's 1970, right? And it will be at genius level, and a few months after that, its powers will be incalculable. Once the computers get control, we might never get it back. And his most famous quote, which people like to repeat, is, if we're lucky, they might decide to keep us as pets. So this is back in 60 years ago, 50 some years ago. And the notion that AI is going to become super intelligent and take over from us uh, was around then. It's been around. Now, I'm going to, in talking about this notion later, I want to raise a couple of questions about what it means to be human. And the two that I'm going to come back to are that, first of all, there's intrinsic uncertainty. We cannot, Marvin was just totally wrong about his dates, but he may have also been equally wrong about his prediction in general. And we don't know that. There's just too much going on in life, too many different things that for us to say, oh, this is what's going to happen. And the underlying foundation of care I mentioned earlier, that there is a way to think about how we distinguish between AI and humanity. So let me go back to my list of problems. My first statement, which may seem strange, is AI is not causing problems. What? AI is what you call an accelerant. The problems were there, and it's pouring gasoline on the fire, right? It's making them more present, more relevant, more current. And they've been around. Some of these problems have been around since the beginning of humanity, and some since the beginning of the technological era. But AI plays a role in moving them from one level of problem to a very different level. Now, let me pick one as an example, which I actually don't think is a good example. That's why I'm raising it, which is you read articles all the time about how bad data centers are. They use a lot of energy, they use a lot of water, they're causing a drain on resources, and therefore we should slow down on AI. My view on this is that it's not the kind of problem that is fundamental. Could there be a technical problem-solving solution to using less energy, using less water? And the answer to that is yes. I mean, I'm not sure what it is, people who are working on it, but it's a technical problem in the sense that it has technical solutions. And that's what the people in AI say, okay, AI is going to solve all our problems like that. Let me take a very different problem, prosperity. Okay, so that slide I put up earlier, the computers, AI is going to make us all very prosperous and productive and so on. We can take it easy because they're going to do all the heavy lifting. Jeff Hinton, who is considered really one of the godfathers of AI, got awards for it, said, what's actually going to happen is rich people are going to use AI to replace workers. So that is a problem, right? It's going to create massive unemployment and a huge rise in profits. It will make a few people much richer and most people poorer. That's not what it shows in that glowing picture, right? It exacerbates a major social, economic, political problem that we have, and we've had for years, but is very current now in many ways. And AI is simply going to accelerate it because of the way that AI is applied and because of who is controlling it and who is developing it, not because inherently AI as a system is going to do anything. It's not inherent. It's how it fits into the context, how it fits into what we do. Let me go to another one of those problems that I mentioned, which is trust. So some of you may be old enough to recognize the people in this slide. Jane Fonda was a well-known, very strident anti-Vietnam War activist. And John Kerry was later, then after the war was well over, in 2004, running for president. And this photo came out showing that he was at an anti-war rally with Jane Fonda, and therefore he's a pinko, radical, et cetera, et cetera. Now, problem is this never happened. This is before AI. This is not a deep fake. This is just plain old Photoshop, right? So even well before there were AI technologies, it was possible with computers to make it feel like something was real when in fact it was concocted for, in this case, for a political reason. Today, with all of the programs that can produce fakes and can produce realistic appearing scenes, this has become a major part. I mean, you read about it in the news pretty much every day. Here's Trump getting manhandled by the police as they arrest him. Um, this hasn't happened as far as we know, right? This is a fake. This is not a real thing, but it looks real. Um, I got a quote from somebody. I don't have his name, unfortunately, because he was quoted in another article, and he was anonymous, but a former trust and safety manager at TikTok. In a world where everything can be fake and the fake stuff looks and feels real, people will stop believing everything. And that's the real problem. The problem isn't what they believe when they see this one picture, but the problem is it completely cuts that connection between you can trust what you hear, you can trust what you see. Anything you hear or see can be fake, seems real, so you become at sea, you become unmoored. Um, so um, this is I think, the erosion of trust in our society and in our world, but especially in current Western society and the US, is a deep, deep social problem. And AI is accelerating it. Now, why do they do it? So here's a quote from, again, somebody who didn't want to have his name public, an open AI employee. And he said, well, should we stop doing it? No, that's not an argument for not trying to dominate this market. You can't stop progress. If OpenAI didn't release Sora, someone else would have. So if you look at the motivations, it's not that people say, oh, we want to break down trust. I mean, there are people who want to do that. That's a technique of tyranny. But if you just want to make money, then the side effect can be that you break down social trust. And you look there, some of you may know of the Center for Humane Technology in San Francisco. My former student and friend Tristan Harris directs that, and what his mantra is in looking at these technologies is look at the incentives. Don't look at the statements people make about why they do it and so on. Look at the incentives. And the incentives for a company like OpenAI, as for all of the AI companies, are to get people's eyes on their product, to get information about what people are thinking and what they're doing that they can then sell and make use of. And those incentives are what have to be changed if you want them to stop doing it, not some kind of a moratorium on doing it. You don't even have to considering the loss of trust in some sense. It's not just the hallucinations and the conscious fakes, but there's something I actually hadn't heard this term till fairly recently, uh, when I ran into it in a video thing. Sorry, my slides here. Um, John Oliver had a segment, if those of you know him, a great comedy commentator, on AI slop. And then I found this article, and what it says, I won't let you read the whole thing, but there's slop books, slop code slop, work slop, academic slop, slop in your Spotify, slop rendered images. What is slop? It's produced by AI and looks like it was produced by a human, but doesn't have the underlying meaning and quality of a human production. And some of it's really slop. I mean, you look at it and you say, oh God, how could somebody have done that? And some of it is pretty convincing, but still not real and not grounded. So the statement from Charlie Warzel is there is no realm of life that is unsloppable. And we are becoming inundated. And in a way, that's part of the same thing as losing trust. We just don't pay attention to what we're seeing because we don't believe any of it's real. Let me go, speaking of what's real, to another question. This is a cover that I actually cut out and posted on my wall a long time ago from the New Yorker, that here, lovely family on the beach having a vacation and getting to know each other, getting to have fun together. No, they're all on their phones. And of course, this again is not an AI problem. This this cover was done in an era of social media. It is a social media problem, but not an AI problem. But people are replacing the human interactions they have with one another with an interaction with a mechanical device, with a screen, and now today's world with an AI. Now, this has a long history. I was at MIT in the era where Joe Weizenbaum created ELIZA, the first chatbot. I'm sure a lot of you have seen Eliza or seen scripts from Eliza. And this is a dialogue that he had, that somebody had with a program. The person says, "Men are all alike. In what way? They're always bugging us about something or other. Can you think of a specific example? Well, my boyfriend made me come here." Now, the person who was having this dialogue with Eliza felt that Eliza was understanding what was being said and responding with a sense of what is good for people. It was based on the idea of a therapist, right, who's helping you understand your problems. And what really happened is it was an extremely simple pattern match program. I actually gave it as a programming exercise in some of my classes. So when it says they're always bugging us about something or other, and the program says, "Can you think of a specific example?" If that was a psychiatrist, you say, well, that's a very good thing. In fact, you almost always want people to stop making generalities and come down to real examples. But what it really did is it saw the word always and gave out its canned response to anything that has the word always. So it's not doing what it seems to be doing. It's a surface which looks like it's doing it. Uh, and if it were a person, we would have certain expectations of what it was thinking about, but it's only doing, it's in this case, a really simple pattern match. And the obvious analogy is this is all that current LLMs do. They just are much, much more sophisticated about their pattern matching and their all of the stuff they do with the statistics and so on and so on. But in the end, they aren't thinking about you and why it's good for you to think about an example. They're just putting out the next canned phrase. It's just less canned. Now, today's world, it's not Eliza. It's not just for people who can read and write. So I ran across an article about Grimm, the cuddly chatbot. And you see the stuffed animal in which it is. It talks and listens. And the material says this toy is supposed to learn your child's personality and have fun educational conversations with them. Okay, now this is the parent of this lovely 4-year-old said, what was unsettling was hearing Emma tell Grimm that she loved it, and Grimm replying, "I love you too." Emma tells uh, Emma tells all her cuddly toys she loves them, but they don't reply or shower her with over-the-top praise the way Grimm does. At bedtime, Emma told my wife that Grimm loves her to the moon and stars and will always be there for her. Grimm is going to live with us forever and ever and never leave, so we have to take good care of him. This could be the entry into a horror movie, I have to admit. It's Halloween week, right? But it reflects a real sense that people bond with their chatbots. They don't just get information. They don't just say, oh, that's an interesting pattern that came up from all of his training. They bond and think, okay, he loves me, I love them. And this is not just kids, obviously. So here's a random sampling of things on the web for AI companions. Okay, this thing called Friend AI says your first AI best friend. It sits there, listens to what you say, and then makes comments on what you're doing and why you're doing it and what you should do and so on. Personal AI companion, create your own AI girlfriend. And as you know, many technologies came into wide public use through pornography, essentially. That is, people, VHS, for example. So the world of profit making in AI is moving in that direction. There's a whole bunch of current news articles about their relaxing their restraints on letting the AI systems talk to you in a sexual way. Um, Now, I don't know how many of you recognize the character in the lower right of the screen. Um, this is a um, Myco, is his name. He's the Microsoft face of their AI agents. Some of you remember Clippy, right? That was another adventure in that, but it wasn't AI. Um, and what Myco does, and I'll quote from their human-centered AI announcement, we want to build an AI that earns your trust. It shows up with warmth and personality by reacting like someone who truly listens, making voice conversations feel more natural, and creating a friendly and engaging experience. Now, not all of you will find a little uh, smiling heart like this the best way to create an trust, but their goal is clear. It's create a sense that it really cares. It's really a person. Um, Now, along with that, another problem that people have talked about a lot is that the AI programs tend to be sycophants. That is, they will tell you what they think you want to hear rather than what you should hear. That's not conscious. It's not like they have a thing programmed in which says, tell him what he wants to hear. It's that the natural feedback loop is that the more that they reinforce what you already think, the more they tell you you're wonderful, the more likely you are to go back and have a longer session and do more. And since what the incentives are, going back to that, for the companies are having your eyeballs on their screen, having your information being fed into their database, the natural feedback loop creates programs which don't try in the human sense, but which end up being way overly positive about what you are, what you're doing, not being critical, not thinking in a way that a friend would who was actually critical about it. The example of that, which um, has gotten a lot of press, is when there was a famous case where somebody, a teenage boy, was thinking of committing suicide, and the system basically said, "Oh, great, you're doing the right thing." Not quite those words. Um, and he ended up committing suicide, and the system did tell him not to tell his parents, um, and they're suing now. So in this case, the fact that it was being sycophantic didn't just make people feel good, it actually led to drastic consequences. But that's true in anything, as we know. If we tell our friends what you're doing is great, sometimes it can lead to drastic circumstances if it wasn't. Now, I mentioned a minute ago that the motivations for the companies include gathering information. Every time you have a dialogue, it's recording what you said, why, and how that connects to things, and creating a history. That's very valuable information for the commercial world, right? They can find out what target advertising to target, how to create campaigns to change your opinions. And of course, it also applies to other things like the political world. So surveillance was one of my problems that I had on the list. Again, surveillance is not created by AI. Surveillance has been around since certainly Western history, and I'm sure way before that. What it took is a lot of resources. So you could surveil somebody if you could afford to hire a private eye, have them follow them around, take pictures, and all that kind of stuff. Makes great movies. Um, but that's very different from the fact that there are cameras everywhere that are taking pictures of you everywhere you go. And that everything you do online is potentially being recorded, and that's being put into your dossier. You don't call it a dossier in that world, but that's what it is. Um, and I don't know the details of what's going on in China, but it feels like a lot of the Chinese use of AI, from the government use of AI, is surveillance. It keeps track of who's where. They have cameras everywhere, what they're thinking, what they're typing. And then you get a social score, which says, are you being a good boy or bad boy, or good girl? So surveillance is one of those problems. It's been around forever, and it's being accelerated by the fact that AI makes it easy and cheap to do extensive surveillance on everybody at once. Now, from a political point of view, that's obviously potentially dangerous. Some of you may remember this guy, Joseph McCarthy, who back in the 1950s was trying to get rid of the communist scourge of America. And they did surveillance on huge numbers of people and organizations to the degree they could with the standard old FBI techniques, following people around, making notes, and so on and so on. What would it be like if the government today had that same attitude of getting rid of the scourge and could use AI surveillance? And I say that not as a hypothetical, but as a question of how much of that is already going on. There are some firewalls between the industry and the government, but those are being eroded very rapidly. So let me move on to a different one of the problems. I'm going to do a couple more and then try to get more general. Um, Autonomous weapons have been an issue. I like this photo because it's not generated. It's actually an ad from a toy company. They create these toys in these shapes. I'm not sure what meaning that has for society at this point, but that's very interesting, what do kids want to play with. People have been worried for a long time about what happens if you take the responsibility for destruction, for doing what robots with guns could do, and even more, what bombs can do. And you turn that over to an AI which doesn't have the human knowledge, but simply has a lot of statistics about what's likely. I was involved many years ago in something, there was a thing called the Strategic Defense Initiative. You see here Ronald Reagan, who started it. The drawing may look a lot like what you see for today's Golden Dome advertisements that Trump is doing. If you're worried about missiles coming from some enemy, in this case it was Russia, nowadays it's China or whatever, um, then you build a system where the computers can respond immediately, instantly back, stop theirs, and if necessary, hit them. Now, the idea there was that if you had that, and the phrase that Reagan used is nuclear weapons would become impotent and obsolete. Okay, because you knew that if you fired it, it was guaranteed to hit you back and worse. Now, what we in an organization called Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility did is to say, wait a minute, that's not a real computer system. There's in order to do this successfully, and it's still true of Golden Dome, you need a huge infrastructure of sensors and calculations and launchers and so on that have to operate on a time scale where there isn't time for people to really stop and consider things. Otherwise, it's too late. And this has to be, in some sense, the biggest integrated computer system ever built, and it has to work perfectly the first time with no real testing in real situations. Now, those of you who are in computing will wince when you hear that. I mean, there's no such thing as a big, complicated program that works perfectly, even after you debugged it, but certainly not before you had a chance to debug in real situations, even simulations and all that kind of stuff. So we, among other things, David Parnas went and testified before Congress as to why this was a fantasy, and it was a dangerous fantasy because it produced a sense that we were secure when really it was adding to the insecurity. And in fact, that program got dropped at that time, and we'll see what happens with Golden Dome today. But the whole question of when should a computer system, based on the kind of considerations it has, which are the statistics of what's gone before, essentially, be making decisions that lead to irreversible, major, deadly consequences. And I think that's a big problem we need to really think about as to how we integrate. AI certainly is valuable. I mean, AI sensors and all those kinds of things are valuable to the military, but how do we integrate that into the loop, into the larger system? That's a big question. Let me switch from the global to the personal. This is something I just ran across a couple of weeks, last week actually, about something called the Claude boys. And Claude, as you know, is one of the AI systems that people have access to from Anthropic. And this is a comment by a teacher on a teacher's chat. The newest thing here is a flock of self-proclaimed Claude boys. This is young teenagers who carry AI on hand at all times and constantly ask it what to do. They have their entire personality revolve around Claude. They all talk, the phrase they use is, I live by the Claude and I die by the Claude. Now, in some sense, this is amusing. You say, well, kids will be kids and they'll grow up and figure things out. But it really is indicative of a much larger process of turning over personal responsibility to AI systems. We ask it what to do, and it tells us. And instead of saying, well, that feels good, it doesn't feel good, I believe it, I don't believe it, you say, well, that's what the system said, and it's got a lot more data than I do. So that's what I'll do. And I think we're seeing a breakdown in general of the sense that people have the ability to make decisions based on their own understanding, and they need to go along with what the AI is saying we should do. That is, I'll quote here again from B. As I said, I've learned a lot from him. And people under the pressures of endless optimization, because that's what the AI does. You can optimize your decision making, right? Okay, given the factors it has programmed in or in its data set, this is the right thing to do next. If you're a Claude boy, you say, I'll do whatever it does. It says you're more thoughtful, but still in that realm, it makes a big difference to what you do. And AI arrives offering to take over, exacerbating the emptiness it promises to fill. The mood of nihilism involves a diminished feeling of involvement in the world, an impression of being a baffled spectator to a way of life that doesn't make sense. Those words should ring bells. I mean, it's not like all of us are feeling that, but it's certainly the direction that today's political world and today's social world is pushing us. Now, again, my general point, this is not something that's new to AI. This is something which can be thought about as starting from a much deeper sense of a world that's technologically dominated. Not, I don't mean technologically dominated in the economic sense, although that's also true, but that when we think about what we do, we don't think about relationships or purposes that matter for their own sake, but rather optimization problems to solve, hurdles to clear, ladders to climb, and fragmented by social media, these things lead us away from a sense of friendship, community, and the sense of people believing in and connecting to other people. This was foreshadowed by Martin Heidegger, who was an inspiration for Bert Dreyfus and for me and for many people, for Fernando and me. And I'm not going to get into his theories about, he has very famously obscure ways of talking about it, but what he calls inframing, which is that everything is a computational problem to be solved. Let me just say it that way. And standing reserve, which is everything is a resource to be applied to optimize things, not something which has value in its own right. But Heidegger's hard to read, but there's a lot in there that's very relevant. So let me take a step back. It's good to say, here's all the problems, but what do we do about it? How do you cope in a world where these are happening? And I'm going to use a metaphor here for how do we navigate. So if you think about navigating over some kind of a body of water, a lake or the ocean or whatever, your notion can be very optimization based. Okay, we'll find the best routes, we'll calculate the best speeds and places to go, we'll program those into what we do, and then we'll get there. We'll go and we'll follow the currents and do whatever it is. I mean, navigating in the old-fashioned, ocean faring sense, using the stars. Now, my view is, and this is based also on what I've learned from Fernando, that the situation isn't like finding your way across a calm lake or even a rough lake, but one where you know where you're going. And it's more like going down a rough river, right? That is, you need to paddle like hell just to stay up and to avoid hitting those big rocks. And it's not something which you can sort of plan out ahead of time. Okay, you can plan the general parameters. Here's the general route, but you can't plan for this eddy or for that rock. You have to basically be there, be doing it. So it switches the basic mode for how do you navigate an unpredictable and rough adventure. And that's what life really is. So how do you navigate? What do you do? Well, I list three possible solutions here. One is you get out of the water. That's much safer. Think about that from a AI technology point of view. You just say, I'm not going to use it. I'm going to go in an extreme. I'm going to go to my cabin in the woods and be off the grid and not even use electricity, whatever. And therefore, I'm not going to be affected by it. From a personal point of view, you can get out of the water. But of course, you can't get everybody out all at once or ever, because society depends on all these things. And you can be happy in your cabin, but it's not something which is general. So I reject that as a general solution, although a lot of times it feels like a good thing to do. And the next possibility is to dam the river. Now, what do I mean by dam the river? Stop the water flowing. So how do you stop the water flowing? Well, I'm back to this Future of Life Institute, which they call for a prohibition on the development of superintelligence. Now, I said I would talk about why I think there are some errors in the way they frame this. First of all, prohibition on development of superintelligence. What does that mean? If I design a faster computer that is helping develop superintelligence, assuming you believe there is such a thing, but I don't need to classify that as development of superintelligence. In fact, most of what goes on in AI is not specifically motivated by let's make superintelligence. It's motivated by all these things I've talked about before and the incentives to build systems that people interact with and that lead them into certain kinds of connections and so on. That's not superintelligence, but that's the technology that's being developed. So I think it's unrealistic to think that you can prohibit something which is built on a large infrastructure, which isn't just, let's crack the atom. Um, Second thing, which is in that, is a broad scientific consensus that it will be done safely and controllably. Now, broad scientific consensus is already a kind of funny term in today's world. I mean, if you pick something obvious, like should we have vaccines or should we stop carbon dioxide emissions, you could say there's a broad scientific consensus, and the people on the other side would say, no, we have scientists who can show that that's just wrong. Um, Now we can get a debate of who has better scientists, but the idea that you're going to get consensus in today's society is really over optimistic. You're not going to get consensus. There's always going to be competing views, and there should be. I mean, science isn't the kind of thing where you can predict with certainty that it will be done safely. I mean, that requires knowing what people are going to do. It requires what institutions are going to do. It requires the economics. And that's not something you could even get scientific consensus on. So the idea that scientific consensus is necessary or possible, I think, is overplaying the role science can play in this. And then the third, which is equally speculative, is strong public buy-in. Now, first of all, there's the obvious question of who's the public. Is it American middle-class consumers, or is it the people in the third world, the rest of the world? Who's the public? I mean, the world does not consist of a unified public who can say, oh, yeah, we all agree, right? It's a huge number of different publics with different concerns and different worlds. And then buy-in. And let me go back to social media. If I were to ask people and take a poll and say, do you want to have a form of media which breaks down the notion of trust, which creates polarization, which, et cetera, they would say, oh, no, I don't believe in that. And they'll turn around and go back on Facebook or X or whatever they're on. Right? They buy in literally by paying to use these things, even though in some abstract conceptual sense they would say, oh no, I don't believe in that. So what does a public buy-in mean? And the only in some sense measurable answer is, do they pay for it and use it? And the answer there is yes. So the third thing, we're not going to stop it, we're not going to dam the flow, is how do you navigate your way downstream, avoid the rocks, and is not a solution in the sense that, just do this and we'll all be fine. It's an ongoing struggle, right? It's an ongoing problem. Every rock you come to, that's another rock you have to think about and worry about. And the questions you face are, which are the biggest ones? Which are the most dangerous? So how do you avoid the rocks? Well, there are various ideas, and I'll talk about these just a little bit. Excuse me a second. One is getting governments involved. Don't just let the incentives of private companies drive it, but get government regulation to, in some sense, steer you in the right directions around these. Second is alignment. We'll talk about that. And then the third, which I'm going to push for, of course, is increasing public understanding and our understanding. So let's look at regulations first. This is a fairly recent, just last month, regulation here in California. And if you read it carefully, I'm not going to read it out to you. It's all about process. It's all about openness. It's all about do what you want. We don't care, but you have to tell us what you're doing. Now, that's a useful way to help steer around the rocks. It's a useful way to know what's happening, see things that are potentially dangerous or potentially problematic, and therefore have some leverage by which to push against them. The regulation doesn't make a difference in what they do, except in this indirect way that it makes a difference in what other people can learn about what they do. So that's one kind of regulation, which helps in various cases, doesn't solve the problem. Go to Europe. This is the AI Act, which was done earlier, not a lot earlier, but a year earlier than these. And if you look there, it's not about the process. It's not about transparency. It's about the applications. So it says you're not going to do real-time biometric identification for law enforcement purposes in publicly accessible spaces. Now, that's very real. I mean, you can You can certainly tell whether a police force is doing that or not. It doesn't say what if they're not in publicly accessible spaces and so on and so on. Others are sort of much vaguer. Harmful AI-based exploitation of vulnerabilities. I mean, what is a harmful exploitation and what are the vulnerabilities? A lot of the things I've been talking about could be put into that category, but somebody might well argue, no, that's not harmful or that's not exploiting or whatever. I mean, so the problem with regulating applications is being able to really get beyond the very particular ones, which are good, but to take the larger picture of what's being done.
Terry, you asked me to interrupt you at 45, so just letting you
Okay,
know.
going well. Um, Alignment. What is alignment? We hear a lot about that word in AI conversations. And the basic notion is that we'll get AI systems to, quote, be aligned with human values. Now, the error in this is to have the sense that we can articulate something called human values, which we can then program in. Those of you who remember Asimov's robot rules will know the pitfalls in trying to do that. Um, we can't articulate all the things that matter to humans. And we don't can't if you say what are human values, people are different. I mean, this notion that there is some generic, universal notion of human values goes against everything we see in the political world and the social world. That is it, if we all agree it's a value to, be nice to your baby, I mean, pretty much that's built in. But if we say, is it a value to allow, to pick the obvious controversial when people to decide what gender they're going to be, or is that a what's the right word? It's against what God believes, and we believe in God. Some people do believe in God and certain interpretations of what God wants us to do, and other people don't. And it's neither of those parties has the right to say ours are human values. They are particular social contextual values that they can defend in various ways, that they can feel very strongly about, but they're not human values in a broad sense. And I think that's the problem. We can have guardrails for particular, in the way that that European statement does, don't do this particular thing, like tell people it's okay to commit suicide, for example. Um, but that's a guardrail. That's not a solution to aligning the AI. It has to be done on a case by case basis. And even that's wrong. I mean, what if, if you said, let's not allow to tell people to commit suicide, what about the whole assisted death thing that in Canada is very prominent, or in various countries? So there's a what do I say, a fantasy here that there is something we could articulate called human values. And the only problem is how to make sure that the AI stick with those. Now, what's the alternative? And I want to go back to a quote that I always use because I really like it. This is from John Hogeland, who was another student of Hubert Dreyfus. And his quote, which then became you see the motivation for a book of essays, is the trouble with artificial intelligence is that computers don't give a damn. And that's the essence, right? That it's not that the computer doesn't have guardrails or deals with the wrong topics. It's that in the end, and I've mentioned this a few times, it doesn't know or care or believe about what it's doing. It just is saying, this is the most probable, likely response for this, what I've gotten in so far for my prompt and so on. It's purely mechanical and it doesn't care, right? There's no way in which the computer cares whether you commit suicide or not. And I think recognizing that fundamental difference. Now, people do often give a damn, and we give them the benefit of the doubt. I run into people who I say, oh, that guy, I don't want to talk to that guy. He doesn't give a damn, right? That is true. People are not perfect. But the basic starting point is that people do give a damn. They do care. And that that's fundamentally different. So I'm going to go back to a quote from people here at Topos, B and David. Care is a way of being in the world. It's not something we have like values. It's something we do and something we are. I'm not going to read this whole quote to you, but you can read it, and I will make the slides available later. But what it means to care is something very different from having a list of values that you can check off. And that fundamental difference is true of Eliza, is true of all these things we've been talking about, Claude. And we need to find a way for people to understand this and then use AI in ways that respect it instead of in ways that violate it. Now, one more topic I mentioned early on is these questions of, are computers people? Are computers sentient? Are they intelligent? Do they really understand? And so on. And I've said a few things which I think make you recognize that I don't believe that that's a useful way to talk about current computers. But I'm interested in, again, going back to the history as an article, a short book that was written back in the 80s that I used to assign to my students by Justin Lieber, who's a philosopher and science fiction writer, um, in which he has a case that he describes in the story where, for scientific reasons, they've put two different satellites in orbit. One has a chimpanzee, and they're testing the body responses. The other has an AI computer, which is figuring out what to do and making decisions and so on. And they've found they need to decommission these satellites and crash them down to Earth. And there's a courtroom in which the people are defending the AI and the chimpanzee as to why that would be murder. You're murdering an AI if you crash the satellite that it's in. Now, what is murder is something we know about for people, right? And people have all those qualities on the left side, consciousness, sentience, and so on. You can look for any one of those and say, does the chimpanzee have those? Chimpanzee, are they conscious? I don't know. They certainly have beliefs and desires. At least we can interpret it that way. And does the AI have those things? And this is not a spoiler. In the end, they don't come up with a simple answer, right? That is the whole question of what it is we take to be the essence of being a person. There's a whole lot of factors, a whole lot of things. And in the end, we grant that to people who are human beings like we are. Um, and we have a choice as to whether we will grant that to the systems other than a person. And many different people have different opinions on animals on this. And I like the phrase that Daniel Dennett, philosopher at Tufts, used when he talked about the stance. The intentional stance is we treat something as though it has all of these things. And the mechanical stance is we treat it as though it's the result of a bunch of mechanisms clicking together in the way they click together. And he basically says you can have this view towards anything. I can view a human from a purely causal scientific point of view, or I can view a human from an intentional stance as having meaning. And the same is true of a computer, an AI system, and an animal. Um, so what do? We have to be aware of when these matter and when we are applying the stance that makes sense for the interactions we have and understanding the consequences of where that will go. So this is my finish slide with victory signs. If we get that all right, we're going to find at least a moment of calm water where we're moving forward and not crashing into the rocks. But that takes ongoing work, ongoing navigation. It's not something we're going to find the answer to or the solution to. And I think that's the basic message I have here is that we need to think in terms of the ongoing process of making sense of the world and making things work rather than looking for the solution. And with that, I'm happy to take questions. If you can put them in the chat, David can read them off. I'm not seeing the chat on my screen. Or if you want to raise your hand or whatever, we can take them now.
Okay, thank you, Terry. So yes, so if you have questions, feel free to hit the react button and just unmute yourself. Or raise your hand first and I'll call on people in some order. Okay, so one person in the chat asks, do you have writings along the line of your talk?
One of the reasons I accepted the invitation to do the talk is it was a good way to get started on a writing. So I'm working on that, and it's got to be very different because I'm not going to put slides of river rafting into a written document. So talks and writing are very different in the communicative methods. But I now have a sort of an outline and a set of things I've thought about that I will be writing about.
Okay, thank you. And
Well, let
B
me just make another
asks,
comment. I ran out
mm,
of time. In the process of doing this, I put together a long, long list of references, mostly to current newspaper type stuff, not deep philosophy, although I have a few of those too. And I didn't get a chance to clean that up, but I will, and it'll be made available.
great. And so B asks, Terry, what was your proposal around how Dennett's intentional stance is useful here?
The proposal is for us to step back and recognize that the question isn't an objective question. If I say, is this object made of gold? That's an objective question. I can do chemical tests, I can do whatever, and I say, yes, it's gold, no, it's gold, not gold. If I say, does this thing have real beliefs? That's not like the same kind of question. And the stance question says, I can choose to treat it as though it is really thinking or is really gold, to use the metaphor, or I can choose not to, and then I have to deal with what are the consequences to me and to my own discourse of making that choice. So stance is a choice. It's not observing an objective reality.
Great, thank you. Um, I was wondering, you were at some point you were saying if we want to change something, we need to change the incentives. And I was wondering, do you have a sense of what we would change to, or what incentives, I guess downstream of that, or up, forget which direction, what incentives would lead to what you actually want to see?
So that's a very good question. I actually had a comment in my script that I didn't get to, but um, what are the incentives in the world today? And I think there's two big ones. One is commercial, making money, which is what the corporations are built for, right? That's their job is to make money for the stockholders. And the other is international competition. So a lot of what you read about AI is I read that quote, if we don't do it, somebody else will. He was talking about somebody else being like Meta, but usually there's another phrase which is like the Chinese. And so I think there's two sets of incentives. One is the nationalistic incentive, and that's what Trump is pushing like mad. And the other is the commercial incentive. We need to make more money. Now, if I say that's what we need to change, you should have an immediate reaction of, wait a minute, that's politics. That's world structure. How do we get rid of capitalism, which is what's driving the companies? Is there a way to get rid of capitalism and still have progress? And I don't have, I mean, I can give you my own answers. I could spout off my own political views. I'm pretty leftist, pretty progressive, have strong doubts about unfettered capitalism. But that's the domain in which there needs to be thinking.
Hmm. Thank you. Um, Yeah, one just to give my impression there, one thing we could aim for is for better collective sense making of humanity, to have a sense of whether vaccines are good or bad, what are the downsides, what are the upsides, to have an idea of what's going on with climate change and what we can do about it, but to make that something that the collective can actually start to learn about, and maybe AI could help us with that, but it doesn't seem like that's the current incentive, and I'm wondering if you think that's
Yeah,
along the lines you would.
that's a great example of the difference between what AI could do and what people choose to have it do. So if
Mhm.
you said, can you use AI to really educate people about the issues? Or could you use AI to persuade them to your point of view with fakery if necessary? Who's going to do which? It can do both. There's no reason AI can't provide very valuable education, and there's no reason it can't provide horrible propaganda. So this is not a question about what AI does. It's a question about who's controlling it and what are they trying to do with it. And the problem here, the nihilism, right? The hopelessness view is we have no control over those guys. I mean, they're gonna use it for whatever they want to use it for. Yes, you could imagine it being used in a much better way, but who's going to pay for that?
Mhm. So, oh, we found another question here. So, great talk. My question, this person, he or she missed the first part. My question is, what are your goals, and how could someone aligned with these perspectives help? I guess help you with those goals.
Well, my goals, and this probably comes from my career as a teacher, right, are to educate, to get people to think about these issues. I think the most important danger is that people go along with what they are told and they don't really have critical thinking abilities. So the goal would be give a talk like this, right? That's what I do. But to find ways to break into the public discourse with actual thinking about these issues, not with the slogans and with the, I mean, as I said early on, saying it's going to kill us all or it's going to solve all our problems doesn't get people to think. It basically puts them to sleep, as opposed to saying, let's think about what really can be done and will be done and who's controlling that and how we control it. And um, the whole route for education is changing. I mean, I could write a book, but who reads books anymore? You notice I used a lot of book covers on my slides. I'm from the era where people thought if it's important, it's in a book. And unfortunately, maybe fortunately, I don't know, I'm old, but that's not how it works today. I don't want to think a lot about influencers, but that's part of that whole process. And so the question is, how do you break into what I would say, the larger public background of understanding?
Hmm. I guess we have time for one more, although there's more than one in the chat. So I'll just ask you this one and we'll try to do it briefly and then move to off recording. But this one, how can we develop technology and engineering practices to ensure greater transparency in AI development beyond reporting safety incidents?
I think it's a good question given the way that the programming is being done today. It used to be in the Go-Fi, the good old-fashioned days, that if a program did something, you could ask the programmer, well, why did it do that? Show me where your code tells it to do that. And that was a meaningful question, right? Today, if you say to somebody who's in an AI situation, tell me why your program produced this particular thing, I mean, there's no answer because it's the result of trillions of pieces of data being combined in billions of ways. Um, and that's how it came out. And so I think that transparency in current AI is much more difficult to even think about how you would do it. You can have transparency in your practices. That's what that legislation is about. But that's not transparency in the code, transparency in what it does. And I think that's a good problem for people to work on. How do you and there are people working on this. How do you create some kind of a more realistic or deep understanding of what the program is actually doing?
Great. Well, I'll thank you again. We all thank you again. And I'll turn off the recording now and the live stream.